we'll kick this off with a discussion around cost. A lot of times we see migration projects get deferred and delayed again and again because of this concern of cost and duration. And we get it. Like, that's a project you don't want to always be owning and leading, but there is a trick to it. The trick here is to use best practices, patterns and practices we'll talk about today, and to use people like, if not to lead, effective partners, as well as Microsoft resources. There's a lot of tools and capabilities that Microsoft themselves have provided to streamline that process. So with that, maybe I'll pass it to you, Boris, and you can dig us in just a little bit deeper into what the typical migration process flow looks like and what are some of those key considerations and investments you need to make.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for that, Richard, and thanks for the introduction. So when we think about migrations, they essentially fall into kind of three high-level categories when we're executing a project. So there's pre-migration, migration, and post-migration. Very simply, those are the major activities that are happening. We like to break it down a little bit further into assessment, planning, preparation, migration, validation, and then finalizing. So we can drill a little bit further. The reason why I mention that is because migration projects, they lend themselves very well to creating a framework and executing that framework to make sure that we do that migration correctly. And whether you're migrating from SharePoint on-premises or you're migrating to SharePoint on-prem to SharePoint online, or you're migrating from a third-party cloud storage application like Dropbox or Box, etc., this framework can be applied in all of those scenarios. And what we found is if you do a really thorough job in that kind of pre-migration stage, where you really understand what you need to move, where you need to go, what kind of situations you're getting into, it makes the migration and post-migration much more likely to succeed and much more clear to execute. And often migrations are in the details. The devil really is in the details in these types of projects. So being thorough in your pre-migration activities sets everything up for success later on. So with that said, I do want to take you through a few kind of key callouts. Again, secrets, tricks of the trade, things that we've seen through many different projects across the years. First thing that I'd like to call out is when you're going through assessment exercises, we really need to be conscious of the fact that there are different tools to help us execute migrations for different source environments. This is a little bit confusing for organizations when they're getting started because some of the tools, they actually sound very similar. They might do similar things as well, but there's actually different tools to apply to the type of source environment that we're working with. So if we're working in a scenario where it's SharePoint on-premises, a common tool that many of you have probably heard of is called the SharePoint Migration Assessment Tool. Whereas if we're migrating something like a file share, there's something called the SharePoint Migration Tool. Very close in name, but actually completely different things. So just something to be aware of. So be mindful of the tools that are available. For instance, with third-party applications like Box or Dropbox, you're going to be leaning on something called Migration Manager, for instance. Now, those tools that I just mentioned, they're all out-of-the-box Microsoft-provided tools, and they have some good core functionality. But if you want to take that to the next level, then you need to go to a third-party migration tool provider that gives you additional features, additional capabilities, and in some cases, additional performance as well. So for instance, AvePoint, ShareGate, they have really great tools that kind of help us in many of these source environment situations. So just be mindful of the tool that you're going to be using to assess your environment. It does vary depending on what you're working with.
And just one key call out there. One of the tricks with source environments is that depending on what kind of environment it is, you might also want to look at some other best practices. So like in SMAT, some of the data is valid and some of the data is stuff you don't need to worry about. So having if it's us or somebody else to review that SMAT data, often for free is a really good starting point to understand what it can and can't do for a SharePoint migration, say from SharePoint Server, some other version of SharePoint Server to SharePoint Online. But another big, really popular one here is when you have, a tool. Let's say you're looking at your landscape and you're like, oh, we're going to move from Slack to Teams. And you think, well, that's not really traditional SharePoint migration, that's more of a Teams migration. Well, it actually is SharePoint migration as well. And so the same vendors and tools that you might be looking at that both do assessments might also have capabilities for that. So like AvePoint with Fly Migrator for, Teams and Slack migrations is a good example. So again, it's just good to know that landscape, because the more you understand these tools, the better you can use them, not just for, say, this one migration you're doing, but more of a migration program set. And reusing those tools often, gives some pretty big dividends in terms of return. So I just wanted to highlight that.